Morning, 3 minutes after 10 is the time. I hope you had a splendid weekend. Can I give you a quick heads up about something that may pop up a little later in the programme? I think we can all guess, after Tom's magical moments just a few minutes ago, I think we can all guess what will definitely not be popping up on this programme. It's all something of a golden rule when it comes to parking ticket related anecdotes. But I don't want to take you by surprise. I don't want to impinge upon your time unduly, but I am keen to talk about the compensation bills that workers may be due if Labour introduces legislation designed to almost outlaw the practice of being contacted outside of working hours by your employer. I just want to sow that seed and see if it sprouts, all right? Because I think that's absolutely fascinating. And it's one of those things where I probably refer too often to pre-therapy and post-therapy, but it is one of those things where if you have put a great deal of effort into convincing yourself that you're a sort of tough, invulnerable, thick-skinned character, then you think that's absolutely fine. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But I think that the more nuanced and sensible approach may be the polar opposite, but we'll get stuck into that a little later. I hate this story. I can't quite believe it either, which is why I am going to have to rely upon you for both explanation and instruction. The third report by the Children's Commissioner for England investigating the use of police powers has been published, is on the way, and it finds that a child was strip searched every 13 hours over the past 5 years. That's quite an unfortunate phraseology, isn't it? I read that from the first paragraph in the Times newspaper this morning, but categorically, it's not the same child. So a child is strip searched every 13 hours in this country and has been for the last 5 years. So 3,368 so-called intimate searches of children in England and Wales alone. One of those days when my Scottish listeners get cross with me if I don't stress that point. I haven't got the figures for Scotland. Perhaps you could furnish me with them. And it's during stop and search or as a part of stop and search practices. And this is between the January 2018 and June of last year. Now, you remember the case of Child Q. A story of almost unbelievable brutality where a young woman or a child, actually, a 15-year-old child, was searched in the most intimate and intrusive of ways while menstruating, and the school let the child down by not being present. So there was no trusted adult present while this happened, and it was one of those stories where you thought that you'd stumbled across something absolutely extraordinary, something absolutely stunningly rare. It was so horrible, the story and the detail in particular, that you just thought this must be a once-in-a-blue-moon event, a black swan event in the context of policing. And then the more we talked about it and the more the media, if you like, responded to this story, the more you realised that it actually went on relatively routinely. And the other factor of it, with grim predictability, relates to ethnicity. 95% of those strip searched were boys. Perhaps that's why the case of Child Q was so arresting. If you pardon a dreadful accidental pun there. The case of Child Q was so arresting because not only was it a girl, was it a young woman, but it was also during her period. So that probably was a black swan event. That probably was something so stunning in the detail that you couldn't take your eyes away from the story. So 95% of the time the suspects are boys, and 27% of the time they're black. So black children are 4 times more likely to be strip searched than white children. And yet all the creeps will still be banging on about two-tier policing on Twitter, claiming that it is somehow knuckle-dragging white people who are on the receiving end of excessive police scrutiny and excessive police force, and even, on occasion, excessive punishment. You're 4 times more likely to have your internal... what's the word we want here? I'm not being prudish. I actually don't know what the word is. An internal examination. You're 4 times more likely to be internally examined by police officers if you're black than you are if you're white. Usually, in fact, in all but a tiny proportion of cases, officers believe that drugs were being carried. 6% of strip searches were for weapons. But of course, the imbalance in policing kicks in now because I'm fairly confident that a child. Well, let me say this with caveats. I'm fairly confident that if the old bill is called to a public school like mine, and this actually happened to me, if the old bill is called to a very long time ago, if the police are called to a private school, to a fee-paying school, shall we say, where the pupil body is predominantly white, and the head teacher has reasons to believe that some of the pupils are smoking cannabis or possibly even sniffing cocaine, I would be very surprised if the practice of cavity searching was, or even just strip searching, was as common as it appears to be for young black children. I'm going to open the phone lines now. I mustn't conflate strip search with intimate search, but I'll need help from police officers on this. What I want to know is whether or not this is something that should happen. Why these numbers are so striking. Once every 13 hours probably sounds even more striking than a total of 3,368 over a period of 5 years. And why the disproportion of males versus females, I think, is probably easier to understand, but it's still something we could flesh out a little further. But why am I 4 times more likely to be strip searched by the police if I'm black than I am if I'm white? Here are the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060973. I don't have the numbers, oddly, for the success of these searches. I don't have the numbers for the amount of times that these strip searches resulted in either discovery or conviction. I did, however, hear the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, talking to Tom Swarbrick this morning about the simple question of necessity, whether this is actually necessary. I don't want to be vulgar, but the quantities involved, if you are capable of swiftly secreting them about your person in a way that is likely to be discovered by strip searches, I don't really see the point. Is this not something we could comfortably say we could live without, unless there's a serious risk of death or a serious risk to health of the person being searched? Is there not something we could comfortably say we could live without? Do we know even what happens in other countries? 0345 6060973 is the number you need. The question really is about strip searches carried out on children, the desirability stroke necessity of the practice, and the disproportion, the likelihood that the massively disproportionate number of black children being searched in this way is not reflective of disproportionate incidents of crime among ethnic minorities. Because I would bet the house on this not happening at a school like the one I went to. When Humberside Drug Squad turned up at my school, I don't think it crossed anybody's mind, admittedly 35 years ago, it didn't cross anybody's mind that we would be stripped naked to establish whether or not we had any drugs on us. Let me absolutely clarify the difference between. See, that's why I got distracted by the Child Q story, which was an intimate search. That is not the same as a strip search. We'll wait for the police to clarify this for us even more in a helpful manner. But even then, the idea of being rendered naked, and the notion of it being 4 times more likely to happen to you if you're black is something that I really want to unpick. There are, if you like, green shoots of progress is the phrase that the Children's Commissioner uses in how the police carry out and record strip searches on children. I am cautiously optimistic, she says, about the potential to overcome entrenched systemic challenges. So there immediately is a dismissal of the idea that this is a necessary response to potential criminality. When you talk about entrenched systemic responses, challenges, entrenched systemic challenges, you're talking about an institutional problem that probably explains the disproportionate incidence of black children being searched in this way. And let me put myself on the line a bit here. If I said to you, and I'll go full, I don't think this is full woolly liberal, full do-gooder, full virtue signaller. If I said to you, I would be comfortable living in a country where children were never or hardly ever strip searched, what would you say to me? It's one of those instances, isn't it, of us all being in favour of the police until we're the ones being policed. The idea of my children being violated in this way makes me want to retch. And I would hope that you would feel the same about your children. And therefore, theoretically, we should feel the same about all children. What do you say to me when I say to you, I'd be comfortable living in a country where this never happens? Let's just clarify exactly what it is that we're talking about with Rachel D'Souza, talking to Tom Swarbrick earlier today.
First of all, I think it's really important that listeners understand what a strip search is, especially since 25% of the 400 or so strip searches that were done last year were done on under 15s. Right? A strip search is all clothes taken off, often at different times. So you're partly clothed, intimate parts exposed, touched, and if necessary, moved. And they're not. And 88% of them are done on suspicion of drugs. I found from the data, and the rest of them done on suspicion of having weapons. And you know, my worry is, in many of the cases still, it's got better, but in many of the cases still, the police are not keeping their own rules, having an appropriate adult,
yes,
making sure that those strip searching are of the same gender as the child,
yes,
and really checking on safeguarding. So some real concerns.
So why does it happen? Why is it 4 times more likely to happen to a black child? Why is it happening at all, given the proportion that are under 15? And what do you say to me when I say to you, sincerely, but with plenty of room for being corrected or you bringing me back to your position, I'd be comfortable living in a country where none of what we've just heard described happens. Price you pay is that some drugs go undetected. Is this an exercise in epic naivety on my part, or is it just a fairly simple reflection of compassion, civilization and decency? Phone lines are open. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 19 minutes after 10 is the time. It's called adulting, James, says Vanessa. Black children are not seen as children. They are seen as adults in the eyes of these people, by which you mean police officers. And I think that's true. I suppose adulting, in a way, it's a form of racism, but it's preferable to overt racism, he says, deploying white privilege at a weapons-grade level. But that might explain why I think this is much less likely to happen to white children than to black children. I also want to know what it's like. I want to know how traumatic it is if it has happened to you or your child, but preferably to you, if you pardon that infelicitous turn of phrase. What is it actually like? How much damage does it actually do? But the question I want you to answer in the first instance is this. Is it crackers to want to live in a country where this is not deemed necessary, where this really just doesn't need to happen in all but the most extraordinary and exceptional of circumstances? 0345 6060 973. Rachel's in Norwood. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Right. So I just want to, well, first of all, I used to be a parent governor. So I have a background in working with schools and also working with how parents teach and how adults teach and teachers teach and children, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things I learned many years ago, and I'm a mother to 3 black sons, and adultification is a major thing, that us in our community have to deal with all the time.
How would we prove that to a skeptic, do you think? And I'm not a skeptic. I'm just
good. No, good. I'm good. Okay, so I do also want to go. I just want to step back a little bit because one of the things you might have, just before we move on, please. So one of the things you did yourself, yourself said yes. Now you're pretty good at this usually, but on this occasion,
there's a big but coming.
What you did on this occasion is that you called her a young woman.
I did, and then I changed it to girl. I changed it to child.
That's right. You did it twice, right?
Yeah.
So
do you know why? Listen, I'm going to go in. I'm going to defend myself on this one. Because if I say girl, then I get messages saying, say young woman. Probably not in the context of this conversation, but infantilization of a 15-year-old. Young woman would be an accusation if we were having a conversation in a different context about something different. So I actually did both to hedge my bets, but it didn't butter any parsnips with you.
No, you could have said 15-year-old adolescent.
It's a 15-year-old child. I prefer even child to adolescent. It's a child. Right. It's a 15-year-old child. She's
still a child, right?
Yes.
So I just want to kind of really make that clear, because that is the issue that we as mothers, fathers have to deal with. There's the conversation for, as soon as they get, if you like, a child gets eye level to their parents, to their teachers, to police. Yeah. For them, it's a threat. I was talking about a book, and I'm not trying to pump the book, but I'm trying to explain the title.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's called Gifted at Primary, Failing at Secondary.
Yeah.
And it's a book for parents of black children in particular. It was right, and so it talks about what's going on. Not just in the education system, like the fact that there's still battering on about slavery and their civil rights. And then you wonder why there's racism, but you've created the victim mentality inside of black children from the off. So you need to change that.
Right.
So that's what's really underpinning this privilege. But anyway, we move on. And so that in itself, that kind of conversation where, if you look back, we know our history, mine in particular, we know that there was this conversation, this subconscious conversation about looking in the eyes of the slave master. Yeah, we know it, you don't, but we do, right? And so when your child hits eye level, there's something almost in the psychology. Yeah, it's almost inherent. It doesn't, and so adultification, turning a young boy into a boy from a man as soon as he gets a little hair on his mouth, a black boy looks like a threat.
So what you've got then subconsciously for a police officer, because if it's conscious, we're talking about something very different.
Sure.
Subconsciously, if I were a police officer, I would see 2 15-year-olds, and I'd somehow subconsciously think the black one was older than the white one.
Yes, well done.
And that would explain why I might be tempted to deploy an invasive tactic like this with a black 15-year-old boy, whereas I would only do it with an obviously adult white suspect.
Well done. Correct.
How would you prove that to someone with reference to sort of modern reality rather?
Well, when they talk about microaggressions, there's also that unconscious bias, and it comes back to cultural competence.
But that's what I mean by that's what I mean by proving it, because you're explaining it with a rich frame of cultural and historical reference. But imagine it was me. Imagine I was this police officer.
Right.
How would you prove to me that I was actually doing that when I didn't realise?
Well, that's a conversation. You see, it's not for me, no offence, but it's really, this is the conversation that black people also have about having to explain everything to people who are not of our colour. Do the work. Now, one of the things I do, actually, is that I am one of... But
the coppers aren't... I'm sorry to interrupt you. The coppers aren't doing the work. The police officers aren't doing the work. Because they don't know that the work is necessary. So I'm going to stick... I have faith in my question, even though you dismissed it very charmingly. Hang on a minute. You have to establish what the challenge is before you can tell people to do the work. And so the challenge is, I am treating people differently according to their skin colour, and it is as a consequence of a process called, somewhat euphemistically, called adulting. How do you actually prove that to someone?
Okay, so it's not a case. It's not about the proving at this point. It's about doing. Look, okay, give you an example.
Yeah.
Let me finish, please. So I've done consultation for the National Institute of Health and Research,
right,
and
yes.
one of the things I did with them is help rewrite their framework for cultural competence. Okay, so one of the things that they did is they did a lot of consultation with the community. Yeah, they had conversations with, okay, what's happening in, when they talk about medical racism, what's happening there? Why are people disproportionately given this amount of care or that amount of care? And it is the same process. Go to them. Yeah, that's the tip. It's the
I have.
kind of
I've read up on that. That's the idea that a black woman is somehow more physically robust than a white woman, so she's going to need less. She's going to need less care in a birthing environment, and the midwife, including sometimes black midwives, will not be as attentive as they would be with a white woman. And you're absolutely right to throw that historical reference all the way back to slavery. But I don't know if the word help is right. But that police officer there, who is currently more likely to strip search a 15-year-old black girl than a 15-year-old white girl, or a 15-year-old black boy than a 15-year-old white boy, tell him what he's doing wrong in a way that will make him reflect and, to use your own phrase, do the work.
It's about empathy, basic empathy. If that is your child, if that was your child,
there it is.
That saying, don't give what you don't want.
Yeah, I think, and that's why I've tried to frame this conversation as a conversation about living in a country where we don't strip search children. Full stop. All children. Yeah. Any child. Thank you, Rachel. Personal experience of it, of course, currently missing from this analysis, and I think that to take Rachel's advice and deploy empathy, imagine it was you. So I have been interviewed by drug officers as an 18-year-old, so technically an adult, although still entitled to have of course you're entitled to have an adult present. You can have a lawyer with you if you want. If during that process I had been stripped, if I had been, to use the Children's Commissioner's phrase, if my intimate parts had been exposed, I think the trauma of that memory would be 100 times worse than it is now. But I don't know. I just think that the blaseness sometimes, but perhaps as a consequence of institutional racism or of adulting, the blaseness with which we talk about 15-year-old boys being strip searched, 4 times more likely to be so than if they're black than if they're white, completely overlooks what a humiliating experience that must be. And Phil makes a brilliant point. He points out that you can't separate this from the county lines phenomenon, where young and vulnerable children are being groomed into these situations up and down the country. They are, if you like, committing crimes through coercion or grooming. In many cases, they'll be absolutely terrified of the people who have put them to work, and the police are coming in and brutalizing them in a hideous way, which means that they have absolutely nowhere to turn. I think Phil's right. I think that's a relevant part of the conversation. I'll take calls from police officers on this, but only if you're going to address the reality of what is happening in this country, or in England and Wales, every 13 hours. Every 13 hours, a child is strip searched. So you can only really helpfully contribute as a police officer if you can tell me why this is happening, how this is happening, and why it's 4 times more likely to happen to black children. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 10:30. Thomas Watts has your headlines. It is 33 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Quite a few of you, as a consequence of Rachel's contribution, quite a few of you raising the case of Shamima Begum, of course, who I think recently lost her sort of last chance of ever being allowed to come back into this country. That has more to do with the fine points of the law than it does with broader social problems. But certainly as a phone-in host, the way people talked about her as a 15-year-old child was probably an example of adultification or something very, very similar, wouldn't you say? Possibly as a consequence of her professed religion, the idea that she deserved to be treated like a fully responsible adult when it came to punishment was certainly very, very popular in a way that perhaps it wouldn't have been if it were a 15-year-old white schoolgirl who had been groomed and trafficked and delivered to ISIS, quotes, consenting, end quotes. I don't know. 10:34 is the time. We're talking about strip searching children, and even the phrase is a little bit hard to credit, isn't it? But it goes on all the time. It goes on, in fact, every 13 hours it will happen over the past 5 years in England and Wales alone. And I want to know why. I want to know whether it really needs to. And I want to know why it's 4 times more likely to happen to a black child than a white child. Graham's in Hackney. Graham, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. How are you doing? You okay?
Yeah, very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I think my point's really already been covered, but I'll just touch on it a little bit more. The core question that you're asking has to do with a lack of empathy. I call it empathy deficiency. When adultification occurs, there is a key lack of empathy on behalf of the person who's got the power. Really.
So this is almost. I know it's numbers, isn't it? So we would all find it easier. We would think we'd all find it easier to feel compassion or empathy for a child than an adult, right? We think, for example, to coin a phrase, children are much more easily led astray than adults. And what this story is telling us, and what you and Rachel are telling me, is that is in deficit when it comes to children of colour. That's why the Shamima Begum example is probably quite helpful, actually, although it's of a very different order to this story. It's about the attitude of adults, whatever their ethnicity, to black children as opposed to white children.
Yeah, because if you don't, and it's to do with care, if you don't care for that child, if you don't care for how you're strip search or how you're holding a child's hand up behind its back. I've done a lot of work with, I can't go into too much detail, but I've done work with the Met Police in terms of, they recently had a stop and search youth charter where they got young people to actually help write a new charter as to how they wanted to be treated by the police when it came to stop and search. And empathy came up constantly amongst young people. They wanted to just be treated like an actual human. They wanted to be treated like they cared, like they mattered. And so if that 47-year-old officer who has a 15-year-old child, and if that officer happens to be white, unless that officer is able to place on that 15-year-old black boy the same level of empathy that he would to his 15-year-old child, there's going to be a problem. And what occurs is there's normally the complete opposite. They treat that 15-year-old black boy similar to what Rachel said. If they've got especially if they've got some whiskers, they've got a little beard, and they've got a little bit of a frown. They treat them like a 47-year-old man. And what you have is just a overhandedness, a lack of empathy, a rawness, a coarseness, and anger just increases more anger because you're treating me like someone who I shouldn't be. And so that aggression
adds to the perception of adulthood.
Of course, 100%, because the adultification is you are treating me like an adult, and so the young people almost feel like they have to act like an adult in order to actually respond to someone being treated, being treated like an adult.
I mean, you might be on the verge of tears and desperate for your mummy, but you're not going to say that in the context. You're probably not going to say that even if the police are treating you with empathy and respect, but you're a million times not going to say it if the police are treating you as if you're guilty until proven innocent, and now you're going to have to drop your trousers and prove it to me.
You hit the nail on the head, though, James, because rather than calling for your mummy and actually crying, what normally happens is they end up, swearing and getting angry and showing their fear and their terror of being treated in this way with insults that further just exacerbate the situation and
make the officer feel he was probably right to come in in a heavy-handed fashion in the first place. I was struck by how many of the rioters in the Farage riots who've ended up in court have ended up bursting into tears in court and actually being able to display that kind of vulnerability and in ways that probably wouldn't happen if they'd been brutalised in the way that you describe.
Absolutely. My final point, James, would just be, if at the core of an officer's role and job was to de-escalate, if de-escalation was the point, I mean, if at the heart of it, if they could always work to de-escalate rather than escalate, and obviously if you're holding a 15-year-old child up, if you're putting them in handcuffs, you're putting them in the back of the seat, back of the car without reading them rights or treating them properly, you're escalating. And if you're strip searching a 15-year-old child without proof and without someone being there, if you're doing it just like in general, because you shouldn't have the right to do it.
They're not going to turn up. Here's the question, right? 10 old Etonians caught in Slough smoking weed around the back of a pub. How many of them are going to be strip searched? Whatever colour they are, to be honest, because as ever with racism, class is never far away. But 10 lads from a school like mine, 10 people suspected of having some drugs hidden about their person. What is the likelihood? Dad's a lawyer, dad's this, dad's the other. What is the likelihood of that happening, of them being compelled to, what was the phrase that the Children's Commissioner used, to move their intimate parts during a search? 10:39 is the time. Graham, thank you. Andrew's in Southwark. Andrew, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, really. Good morning, James.
Hello.
Really, 2 points, really, although a third one has now risen from your last caller. The first thing is the adultification of children. And that's briefly been touched on.
Yeah.
So you look at the way Shamima Begum has been treated as a 15-year-old and not seen as a victim in any sense. And you look at the way in which other people, much older, I can think of the university student in Oxford who stabbed her boyfriend, and the judge had nothing but empathy for her, and how the medical student, and how it might affect her career going forward.
That was a remarkable case. And we're not anti-empathy. We just want it to be a little bit more equally applied.
Yes.
I think the better example, and Joe's reminded me of this. I'll give you plenty of time to talk, Andrew, don't worry. But while this is fresh in my mind, Joe's been in touch to say Shamima Begum wasn't trafficked to ISIS, though. She stole money from her parents, bought her own plane ticket and travelled voluntarily. I don't care if someone is white, brown, or even bright green. She was old enough to be criminally responsible for joining a terrorist group. And, of course, the victims of the grooming gangs in the north of England, the grooming gangs of predominantly Pakistani origin, one of the reasons why those cases went uninvestigated or not properly investigated for so long was because people in authority thought that underage children were, to use Joe's language, perfectly capable of making these choices, perfectly capable of being responsible. So it's the inequality of application, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The second brief point, and it's coming back on something you just said, that if 10 kids, I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure that 10 old Etonians caught, maybe not even smoking cannabis, maybe suspected of being doing cocaine in the toilets. I'm fairly confident they wouldn't be stripped. I could be wrong. Maybe we'll get a call from an old Etonian.
You're right. No, I think you're right. But not if they were all black. Not if they were all black. If they were all black, they would be treated very differently. But the third point really is this, and the most important one, the adultification of black children is not something that's new. It's been something that's been going on for decades. And I am certainly aware of a situation and if I could just tell you this story, it's a very short story.
Of course.
A situation, it's probably the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. And there was a robbery by some young black children.
Right.
Off license. It happened very late at night. And the owner chased the group away very, very bravely. And he noticed one of them go into a house not far away. So he called the police and he staked out the house, and the police arrived. And a couple of hours later, 5 black youths come out of the house. Okay, so the police know only one is involved, but they've got to identify which one.
Right.
So they stop the youths, they arrest them all, no issue. They then make a decision, it's about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe they hadn't recovered the gun, to go into the house and search the house. Again, no issue. And inside the house is mum, a 10-year-old daughter, and her 4-year-old son,
right,
who's asleep in a T-shirt and underpants. And they are taken to the police station. Mum is strip-searched in front of her children, and then the children are strip-searched, including the 4-year-old.
This is a case you have personal knowledge of?
Yes.
What reason would be given for strip-searching the mother?
They were looking for a firearm. It was
so they've
unlawful.
hidden. The accusation is your mum has hidden it, or you've hidden it on your young sibling, or on this child, on this 4-year-old.
Yeah, presumably.
Yeah, sure.
Presumably, but you know, the fact is, this 4-year-old was wearing a t-shirt and underpants, and they were looking for a firearm, and they had him remove his clothes.
Yeah.
At 3 o'clock in the morning. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for decades. And I suppose they do it for that reason. They don't see.
So it's an exercise of power. I mean, there's no adultification going on with a 4-year-old child, is there? That is explicit, overt abuse, and an abuse that would be highly unlikely to happen to a white child in the same situation. We'll never find out your response to the 10 black Etonians being suspected of having drugs about their person, because it has almost certainly never happened. But I would like to pin down the class element of this as much as the race element, albeit that it is a secondary consideration. Thank you, Andrew. Interesting text from Rob, who's in Maidenhead. He said, your continued reference to the Farage riots is unacceptable and could have, I hope, legal consequences for LBC. Some fascinating research with the Huffington Post this morning, who have commissioned Setanta, the pollsters Setanta, to look in... Savanta, I beg your pardon. Setanta is a bookmaker, isn't it? Savanta, Savanta, or they've seen the polling on who the average voter believes was, quotes, responsible, end quotes, for the riots that have blighted our streets in recent weeks. About half of British voters believe that Nigel Farage is personally responsible for the riots which broke out across the UK earlier this month. 51% of the public blame him for the disorder, which led, of course, to hundreds of arrests and tough prison sentence for some of those involved. And Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, the serial criminal and founder of the English Defence League, he actually pips Farage into second place. 54% of the public consider him to be personally responsible. So unlucky there, Rob. Prisons are increasingly using body scanning techniques instead of strip searches. So, even if you were worried about criminality going undetected, the technology should really have overtaken the practice of strip searching children by now. And speaking of prisons, John Podmore, regular contributor to LBC, as a former governor, as you may know, of Belmarsh and Brixton Prison and Swaleside Prison, he's been in touch to say children subjected to life-changing trauma to allegedly look for a substance which is legal in most of the USA and increasingly elsewhere. That puts a slightly different perspective on things as well, doesn't it? 10:48 is the time. Ben points out that he's amazed that Nigel Farage can find the time to incite race riots, what with all his other jobs. So someone's been paying attention to the news over the weekend. Omar is in South Woodford. Omar, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me on. I'm really, it's a really personal discussion with me, to be honest with you. I've served 7.5 years in prison, and since coming out, I've become a prisoner advocate. I'm a peer mentor. I've supported multiple universities, organisations and charities, support ex-prisoners. But, on reflection on my life, I suffered the most traumatic experiences as a kid. Not only was I stripped searched at the age of 15, dragged into Holborn police station by an appropriate adult, I suffered a physical abuse, so did my peers. And, it's such a complex issue because racism plays, in my opinion, racism is at play, classism definitely is at play. I would say the Stanford experiment that highlights a few things that I think once people have power, what do they do with it? And
yes.
I think it's really pertinent, James, because one thing I always talk about is my experiences when I went to Felton when I was 15, and it was the most dystopian, the most traumatic, the most just horrific experience of just young broken children abusing each other, with the officers standing by and just kind of getting like really friendly with kind of like the alpha, I would say, I don't know if it's the right term, the
Sure.
alpha prisoners, it just becomes such a vicious cycle. And I hear people talking about their experiences, and I just think I suffered that in the 90s, and it seems like nothing has changed. It's just horrific.
Well, take me back if you can. You don't have to. I don't want to upset you.
Of course, no, not a problem.
To that evening in Holborn, because for the first time, and despite the quality of contributors so far, you're the first one to sort of make me realise completely that this must be seen in parallel, in tandem with much more obvious and much more easily condemnable incidents of police racism. So this might actually be technically permissible in some circumstances in the way that other examples of police racism are not, the use of certain language, the use of violence. But this is part of the same arsenal, I think, listening to you.
100%. No, I really appreciate it, James. Thank you. And what I would say, I'll give a backstory to that.
Yeah.
You know, I was up to no good.
Sure.
You know, I was a little terror, and I was mouthy. And I remember I was walking back from Farringdon, going to where I lived in Holborn, and I was not far from the Holborn police station. The van pulled up to me, and actually I got stopped 3 times en route, actually. So on the 3rd time they stopped me, and then that time I think they just had enough. They dragged me into the back of the van. And I think I said something, to be honest with you, I think what triggered them is some of the most idiotic thing. I think I said something negative about the Queen or something a 15-year-old
About the Queen?
About the Queen.
Right.
Honestly, something...
You're trying to get a reaction. You're trying to wind up.
Yeah, I was trying to get a reaction, and just stupid, they dragged me into the police station. They strip-searched me. It was absolutely humiliating. And prior to that, I was strangled in the police cell by a police officer. And I always was scared going in there thinking, actually... I didn't know what could happen. So when that happened, I didn't know what, thoughts were running through my head. I was released. I told my mum about it. And I come from a dysfunctional family. We had a few problems. And it's no one's fault. It is what it is. But, thankfully, she went to my solicitor and I was going through, I was trying to get some legal, trying to do something with it. But unfortunately, I went on the run, committed more crime. I went on the run and that just got swept under the rug. But, it's honestly, but see, when I become an adult, James, utter abuse and utter disregard.
Why did you break the cycle? Because you described the situation in Feltham, and you've come out determined to help other people in that situation. Yeah. The environment you described would make it more likely that you'd sink further into reoffending and recidivism, and you'd be sort of neck up chin. That's why we know that. What broke the cycle for you?
Do you know what it is, James? Thank you for asking that. It was. I was at a Rubicon and I was either going to go headfirst so deep into it I would never come back again. Or I decided to change, and thankfully serendipity came involved. And when I came into prison in Exeter, I got convicted for 8 years for a crime of commercial robbery on a jewellery shop. So when I first went into prison, the first job that I got was a foreign national rep, a black minority and ethnic rep. And Exeter didn't have many ethnic minority prisoners in there. So I really loved that work, to be honest, James. I really loved the work, and I fell in love with helping people. I gravitated towards, throughout that 4 years, I gravitated towards roles that were reflective upon that. But to be honest, you know what changed me, James? And you're going to love this. I know you're going to love this. It's reading. It's reading books. I read books, and I fell in love with the world. My value system changed beyond what I loved in the criminal world. I understood I had more to give to the world. I know it sounds cliche, but honestly... It
doesn't sound cliche.
But when I came out of prison, I was dead set on committing crime again, but then serendipity raised her head again. I met my most amazing partner, who's a teacher, who's also a special needs teacher. I think she can understand the backstory of what I was coming with. And then I fell in love with her. We fell in love with each other. I became a father for the first time. And, went to university, got a degree in business management, entrepreneurship, but then hit the biggest brick wall of having a criminal record. Felt really utter despair. One, I'm not a criminal no more, so I don't have that access to free money. Right. I got the responsibility of being a father. But then I came across the charity called Project Remake. And that was a platform that allowed me to showcase my talents, who I am. And it's been, Dan Hill since then. I'm a social value manager for Capita right now. I support, many organisations and charities. I work with many universities.
I hear you. It is going to be the rare route, isn't it, from the experiences you had as a teenager, and that idea, everything that we've heard in this hour contributes to the sense that, oddly, if you really want to come at this from a societal point of view, the 15-year-old boys who are in trouble, the 15-year-old boys who are getting into bother and are on the either indulging in or on the fringes of criminality, are less likely to end up like Omar, the more brutalised they are in those earliest years. So he's an exception to the rule in really obvious ways. Omar, thank you. 10:55 is the time. Of course, being convicted of crimes doesn't always involve coming up against brick walls. One of the people who popped up in Nigel Farage's register of interest that was published at the end of last week is a convicted fraudster. Spent, I think, 8 months in prison in America on money laundering suspicions, and he paid £9,000 for Farage to have a jolly to Belgium last year. Not sure why, but there you go. If you're from a certain sort of background, then criminal convictions are no obstacle whatsoever to future advancement. You can even end up bankrolling trips to the European Union for the leader of Reform UK Limited. Thank you, Omar. Sam's in Manchester. Probably the last word on this. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hi, I just want to say, firstly, I really condemn some of the overzealous behaviour of police officers mentioned by some of your previous callers. It's horrible to hear. But as a police officer, I wondered whether I could give a little bit of clarity maybe on why strip searches are being used, because it's not always to add to the criminality of someone or to jump up the charges that are going to come up against them.
Of course.
When somebody comes into a custody suite, there is a duty of care towards that person. And if they're being strip searched, it's highly likely due to it being a possession with intent to supply and not just a case of possession. And with intent to supply, they're likely to secrete it on their persons where it's not going to be found. So if we found drugs and we've arrested you, okay, that's happened. But if then we put you into a cell with further drugs and to get rid of them, it happens where people swallow the drugs.
Of course, this is what Rachel D'Souza is referring to when she says it should only really happen when there's an immediate threat to life or an immediate threat to health. That's what you're reiterating.
But how can you gauge there's an immediate threat to life?
Well, if you think someone has swallowed, for example, crack cocaine, then you would be perfectly within your rights to claim that you thought there was an immediate threat to life. If you're shining torches up the private parts of a 15-year-old schoolgirl who's menstruating, you're clearly not.
No, and that I understand. But you don't know if there's a threat to life until the search has been done.
Well, only if the search is successful. If someone's in the process of swallowing something, you're going to have to be incredibly... and they're only, remember, going to be swallowing it in the first place because they're worried about you finding it. So if these kind of searches weren't allowed, the price you pay is contraband or drugs going undetected, but the return you get is that the risk you're worried about ceases to exist in that moment.
There have been occasions, and there have been quite a few occasions, where they haven't been searched properly and the drugs have been swallowed.
Yes, but if there was no prospect of being searched intimately, there'd be no need to swallow the drugs in the first place. That's why I say it's a trade-off. It's a utilitarian trade-off between, you get lucky, you find it in someone's bag or pocket or about their person or in their sock, but the trade-off is that because they don't feel compelled to have to swallow it, the risk you're worried about, the risk you're using to justify the entire practice of strip searching children ceases to exist in that moment.
There are occasions where if they've got the chance to swallow them and they've been in their cell, the likelihood is they weren't going to be strip searched. You wouldn't be left alone to then be strip searched at a later point.
Right. So why would they swallow it then?
Yeah, exactly. It's a question. It's a question. I don't
think you're allowed to say exactly in this point. This is my theoretical universe in which there's no need to strip search them, and therefore they wouldn't. It's the fear of being strip searched, Sam, that makes them swallow the drugs. We can both agree about that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So you can say to me, they didn't need to worry about it, but it sounds a little bit flat. That really. To everybody.
No, but it does happen. If they're put into a cell and they're left alone, they're not going to be strip searched, because at that point you've lost your justification for a strip search.
Okay, so you need to explain that to them, and then you'll be confident that they're not going to try to swallow anything. Of course, the job that you do is nowhere near as simple as we can make it sound during these conversations. Thank you for your contributions. It's gone 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Subject that I find fascinating. Back in the news today after a non-executive NHS England director argued that we have too much mental health awareness, that there are difficulties coping with current levels of demand, and therefore we should stop promoting awareness of mental illness and possibly, we dig into his words a little further, stop diagnosing it as well. not for the first time, much cleverer than me. 4 different people have already spotted that if we were to reduce awareness or even diagnoses of mental illness, then we would be in very similar territory to when Donald Trump wanted to reduce the number of COVID tests in order to bring down the number of COVID cases. However, I have to keep in sight the person that I used to be for 2 reasons. Number one, it's instructive, and there's no point having a mind if you're incapable of changing it. And number 2, you could always change back. Just because you think you were wrong 10 years ago doesn't mean you're right today. You could be wrong today. You could be wrong 10 years ago and wrong today. Or you could be wrong 10 years ago and right today. Or you could have been right 10 years ago and wrong today. You'd take my point. Certainty is a fluid human condition. But I like these 2 stories in conjunction with each other, actually, because what you have is a non-executive NHS England director who I think may have been slightly misreported, talking about why it might be unhelpful to classify or to record mental disorders when they are A, not that serious, and B, you're not likely to get much help with them, given that the demands the NHS is currently facing. I don't know about that. I mean, the second bit is just true, but just because you can't get the help that you may need doesn't really mean you should be made less aware of the fact that you need help. Because the other story that's appeared today in a similar space, this was in the Sunday Times yesterday, I think, or the Times early today, eating disorders in children have doubled in the last 8 years. I don't know if you've ever had to deal with an eating disorder with a child, either your child or a loved one's child. It is unthinkably awful. The powerlessness that parents feel is off the charts. And yet, to take the logic of the first story, the mental health awareness not beneficial when NHS can't cope, and apply it to the second story, you would end up arguing there's no point diagnosing eating disorders because, look, the number of diagnoses has doubled over the last 8 years and the access to treatment is worse than it's ever been, some waiting more than a year for treatment. In other words, you don't get rid of the problem by saying let's stop talking about the problem or let's stop identifying the problem. What I don't know, though, is this. When we hear that a quarter of young people, Generation Z, describe themselves as having long-term mental health conditions. The average for all adults is about 8. And what Sir Simon Wesley has done is visit medical schools and speak to students. So this is anecdotal, but from somebody authoritative. And when he spoke to 40 different groups of students from this cohort, from the so-called Generation Z, or Generation Z, if you're American. Is it Generation Z in America? I presume. Anyway, he found that when you push them a bit, his words, they weren't talking about the kind of disorders that we're talking about, depression, anxiety, and so on. They were talking about loneliness, homesickness, exam stress, academic pressure, and concerns about climate change, which we probably wouldn't really classify as mental disorders, because they don't really respond to the kind of psychological treatments we give. So what is anxiety then in his world? If being, I would use the word, disproportionately worried about stress, loneliness, exam results, climate change, surely the decision on whether or not somebody has anxiety in a medical sense isn't based on what they're anxious about, it's based on how crippling their anxiety can be. So rather than saying, what is it that you're anxious about or what is it that you're depressed about, surely, and look, he's the professor, not me, surely you say, well, how is this impacting on your life? They say, I can't get out of bed and I'm frightened of everything. I am in a state of almost constant fear. Sometimes it's an unspecifiable fear. So sometimes I literally couldn't tell you what I'm scared of, but I am paralyzed with fear and terror. And to turn around to that person and say you don't have a mental health disorder in the traditional sense, because I'm not sure that this would really respond to the kind of psychological treatments we give, strikes me at first glance, and I've given you as many of his quotes as I can, as incredibly unhelpful and possibly rather arrogant. But as I say, he's the professor. I'm not. The conclusion he arrives at is that this is also driving up demand. The fact that young people are dramatically more likely to talk about mental health than those before them. It's also driving up demand, which the NHS is not set up to meet. Therefore, this is the conclusion, continuing mental health awareness may not be as beneficial as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. There are fears, I read in the Times, that doctors are overdiagnosing the conditions because diagnoses have risen sharply. Depression and anxiety, in particular, between 2000 and 2010, went up exponentially. ADHD and autism referrals have risen fivefold since the pandemic. Do you know what I always think of during these conversations? I always think of dyslexia. If you were at school in the 1950s, there was no such thing as dyslexia. Give or take a few vanishingly rare examples, perhaps. I don't even know if it had been given that name at that point. And now, of course, dyslexia is a widely understood and frequently diagnosed condition. So does that mean that we've worked too hard to identify and understand dyslexia? Or does it just mean that an awful lot of people struggled with burdens that society neither recognised nor empathised with? I suspect the same is true of all of the conditions that some people currently find it amusing or helpful to poo-poo. And I can say that because I used to be one of them. I used to be one of the people, and if you've come to this programme relatively recently, you may find this hard to believe. I'd be flattered if you did find it hard to believe. But I used to be one of the people who said, we just called it being naughty in my day. We just called it being naughty in my day. The more you dig into these subjects, the more obnoxious that position becomes. And I can say this because I publicly held it. I looked at the issue of masking, particularly in the context of autism, and the knowledge that you are what are the best words to use in these contexts? The knowledge that you are not the same as the people around you, but you desperately want to appear as if you are. So the effort that you put into masking will take an enormous toll on your mental health and indeed sometimes your physical health, to the point where you may encounter people who struggle to believe that you have a condition, that you have autism. The relationship between understanding and diagnosis is fascinating to me, absolutely fascinating. And I use dyslexia just as an example, in the same way that no one, I don't think, would argue that eating disorders have doubled in 8 years because we are spending too much time on identifying them and understanding them. And yet it seems to me that this argument is that mental health is rising exponentially among the younger generation because we are spending too much time diagnosing and understanding. But there is a proper conversation to be had here. Dylan says we just haven't reached the levelling out point for mental health. I think he's right. But it's very hard for someone of my age to understand why there is a medicalised explanation for what we would once have called, I suppose, normal feelings. That it is hard. I'm in my very early 50s, and I struggle sometimes. I certainly used to struggle a lot more to get past the point where you just say, well, this is what we used to call being sad, or this is what we used to call, when we use the word depression, we weren't talking about something clinical. We were talking about something emotional, something normal. I mean, most of us, if you were listening to The Cure or The Smiths, you probably would have described yourself as a depressed teenager. But here's what I don't think. I don't think that the 16-year-old me listening to Morrissey and Robert Smith, I don't think that he today would consider himself to be mentally ill. He might revel in Gothic poetry and listen to dirge-like music, but I don't. But he could get out of bed every day and he could go to lessons. he could fulfill his responsibilities. On the days that he didn't, he was genuinely being lazy. That's the problem I think we've got generationally. The problem we've got generationally is they're almost certainly telling the truth. And yet we see their reality through the lens of our own truth, which isn't the same as theirs. So let me give you an example. Paul's been in touch. He says, "Oh dear, the poor little thing, such struggles this woeful Generation Z faces. Good job they weren't alive during the war. We'd all be speaking German." So what Paul completely misses is the extent of mental health disasters among that generation, the instances of alcoholism and domestic abuse that were direct consequences. In fact, Paul may himself be one of the direct consequences of growing up in circumstances where mental health was considered taboo, where conversations were barely conducted, where the emphasis on the energy was immediately put into silencing things. And it means that entire generations of people grew up repressed, angry, emotionally absent, emotionally distant, and profoundly troubled, while spending most of their waking hours congratulating themselves on being so robust and believing that all you have to do to get through difficult times is pull your socks up, and then you go home and beat the living daylights out of your wife. So that's why mental people who may not traditionally strike you as having had mental health problems are an important part of this story. The same with dyslexia. So how do we know? How do we explain to somebody skeptical? I don't mean an idiot like Paul. I mean someone sincerely skeptical. So not even me, sadly, because I used to be an idiot as well. But I did also sincerely believe, because I thought it had worked for me, that stiff upper lip, pull your socks up, get out there and carry on would somehow work. How do we describe the difference to a skeptic? How do we prove that the massive majority of young people describing mental health problems are not simply giving things that we had too new names? And even when they are giving things that we had too new names, it means that our lives would have been much better if, like a dyslexic in the 1940s, we had known what was, quotes, wrong, end quotes, with us and got the help that young people get today. So I don't know what the cut-off point is. I don't know where the line is. But when somebody tells you that young people don't really have mental health conditions, they're just citing things like loneliness and stress and academic pressure and concerns about climate change, at what point does it become, if you like, medicalized anxiety? Let's just do this. We don't have any qualifications at all, but we have experience. We have shared experience. What medicalized anxiety? How would you describe it? Because if someone tells you that they're suffering, do you know what the single worst thing you can do is? Tell them that they're not. If someone tells you that they're struggling, and it comes from such a kind place sometimes, it comes from a slightly selfish place. Because what happens is you are so keen to restore the equilibrium in your own emotions, particularly if it's someone you care about, and they tell you that you are struggling, or they tell you that you are suffering, because you don't want them to be in pain because their pain hurts you, right? You try to tell them that they're not. You try to argue them out of their own struggling. You try to tell them things aren't as bad as they think they are. And do you see what I mean when I say that that can come from an enormous place of love? You try to tell them that you are that you just need to be a little bit more robust. You just need to be a little bit more resilient. You can get through this. Whereas the best thing you can do when someone tells you they are suffering is sit with their pain, acknowledge their suffering. And yet it's such an English condition, this, very much, not confined to public schools, but my goodness me, it sort of has its apotheosis in that public school environment where vulnerability is weakness, where emotional literacy is suspect, where feelings are unimportant and to be tamped down. So when someone tells you that they're struggling, the first thing you can do, the best thing you can do is simply believe them. The worst thing you can do is tell them that they're not. And I've got a horrible feeling that this story fits into the second category. Or when someone tells you that they're struggling, you tell them that this isn't a very big deal. I think that's up to you, isn't it? How big a deal is your mental stress at the moment? Who gets to decide how much you're struggling, me or you? I haven't asked you very simple questions here. I haven't nailed, if you like, the issue, but I've talked in some depth in a way that I hope will encourage you to contribute to the conversation. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It is 22 minutes after 11. Alex puts it well. So be robust and become a bully. It is extraordinary how many people who espouse the idea that the younger generation is being self-indulgent or that people just need to pull themselves together are actually bullies themselves, whether they realise it or not. And Adrian takes up that point. He says, James, the worst thing you can say to someone is pull yourself together. I was diagnosed with bipolar 25 years ago. And Alan says, again, nail C head. Thank you, Alan. I do my best. Phrases like, what have you got to be anxious about? Or stop worrying all serve to minimise people's experiences. And this from someone who's asked me not to share their name. A message for Paul. I have had mental health issues. I've been to war 3 times. I'm still serving. Saying that if these people were around during the war, we'd all be speaking German is a ridiculous and pointless thing to say. It's a stupid point of view, commonly held by people who have no clue what it takes and how it feels to put a uniform on. Lots of messages coming in. I'll do my best to air as many of them as possible, but I want to get to the phones. Mike is in Stratford-on-Avon. Mike, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
It's interesting that last text you just had there as well, because I too am a veteran of Afghanistan who now works in the mental health sector.
Well, it's a good job you weren't around during the war then, otherwise we'd all be speaking German.
No. How would I have hacked it, eh? But, in working in the environment I do, I get probably asked the general question of the many questions you've been asking this morning around when is it a genuine issue and when is it just feeling sad. I get asked that almost every day, and it's very difficult to give a very binary answer. And sometimes I feel like I'm copping out by saying, well, it's dependent on the individual and their circumstances, but it really is. On the differences between generations, the first thing I would say is I think that every generation thinks that the generation after them is softer than they were. Yes. I think that's just hardwired into us as human beings. But that aside, when people ask me that question about the resilience of young people, it can be coming from a place of genuine care, actually worrying about their own children. I just ask them to look at the experiences that their children are gaining at a very early age, growing up, that perhaps me, looking at my background, growing up in a little village in Essex of 100 people, would have been protected from. And it's easy to cite social media and smartphones as the only reason for that, but it is a big reason. We know there's a brilliant book called The Anxious Generation that a lot of people are lauding right now from a guy called Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, we had him on. We had him on the show a few weeks ago.
Oh, you've had him on. Yes. He's amazing. Yeah, and you know,
it's not universally lauded though. There has been some pushback, and there has been some challenge to some of his theories. He's particularly interested in unregulated social media, but you know, the climate crisis, intergenerational inequality, wage theft, all of these things are, you could argue the logical response to them is what would once have been described as a mental disorder, but is now, I'm thinking of that old joke about I'm not paranoid, they really are out to get me. There are lots of things to be very, very, very anxious about at the moment.
Absolutely. And when your attention is turned inward on yourself, predominantly through things like, I sound like I'm banging on about smartphones too much, but it does put our emphasis, things like social media, it does put an emphasis on the self. And you think about the way we communicate with other people now, everything that you communicate is up there to see and to turn over. And do people like what I say? Do people not like what I say? It doesn't really lend itself
There's
to
an internal
self-esteem.
An internal tumult that is almost impossible for many adults to turn off or to turn down. A pal of mine just got back from holiday, and he said to me this morning, He said, I actually managed to zone out for a whole week. I can't remember the last time I did that. And that's on holiday in a beautiful part of the world. But that is because of these infernal things that we all have in our pockets. Can I ask you something which I don't think you have, well, you probably have thought about before, given how often you're asked the question about where the distinction lies between what you might call sort of traditional feelings and medicalised conditions. How confident are you that where do you derive your confidence that tightening the lid, screwing down the sensitivity, stiffening the sinews, pulling up the socks, people living repressed lives didn't sometimes benefit from that?
Yeah, I think there is something to be said for resilience and owning your mental health as well. Yeah. It isn't someone else's responsibility in the same way with your physical health. You can have all the wonderful support and rehabilitation and equipment and everything that you need. If you aren't willing to get your backside out there and go for a jog or sit on a mat and strengthen your leg, it's not going to get better. So I think there is an element of ownership. My question would be, where did we learn that? What's different with us? We're all born the same, you know. So where did a previous generation learn that resilience or take it from? And I tend to find myself thinking a lot of it will be community, the protection of community. There are a lot of factors, clearly we understand, where if someone is faced with inequality or intolerance or stigma or a lack of safety or care in the home, that obviously lends itself as a risk factor to challenges and resilience. But I think there is an element of being bombarded at a younger and younger age with the ills of the world, as well as a cutting off and isolation. We live increasingly vicariously. We don't operate in communities. I've heard you talk a lot about community and connection before, and I think it's something that's really undervalued and underemphasised when we talk about mental health. We think a lot about diet and exercise and sleep, which are all really fundamental cornerstones. But I think connection and community is something that has been eroded. You add a pandemic in there, which at a formative age for our young people, they were stripped of all of that. I think that is going to turn anyone inward, and that's going to worry anybody. So I think that there is something to be said for cultivating resilience. But my question to an older generation bemoaning a younger is, where did you learn that? Where did that come from? And how can we recreate, rather than just bemoan the fact that they're all snowflakes and they can't deal with it? Because I don't think that's fair.
You're bloody good.
Thank you, James.
No, you really are. I bet you're great at your job, because I literally said at the beginning of that, you may not have given this much thought before, so it possibly is a little unfair to ask you the question, but you just knocked it out of the park.
I give it a fair amount of thought.
Yeah, clearly. Let me read you something that ties in with what you say and possibly focuses upon the fact that community doesn't always mean the broader group around us. This is from Rich, who works as a listening volunteer with the Samaritans, and he says one of the things that many people say when they call is that they don't feel they can share their mental health issues with family and friends. It's heartbreaking when they say things like, I don't really have anything to worry about, or there's loads of people worse off than me. Mental health issues are not necessarily logical. Please don't be afraid to reach out if you're struggling. And he reminds us of the number for the Samaritans, which is, of course, 116 123. And that's why incidences of suicide in particular among young men are the highest in society, aren't they? Because we are, I don't know if I can say we anymore. I could when I first started talking about mental health on the radio, but I don't know if I'm a young man anymore. But young men are the most likely to feel that they are letting themselves down or letting the side down if they talk about emotional vulnerability, if they talk about mental health. We
don't want to burden other people. We feel a guilt about our own situation. Again, that's something
masculinity, bogus masculinity, hardwired into us. Briefly, if you would, because you've been so impressive, what made you make the shift from military to mental health training?
So I, like a lot of people who work in this area, have had my own challenges, and I have felt everything that you just described in terms of looking at my own privileged situation with a job and a roof over my head and everything you'd want, and wondering, what have I got to feel anxious and worried about? Why does everyone else seem to be able to just cope and do it? And what's wrong with me? And that, again, doesn't lend itself to sharing, because you feel that guilt and that shame.
Something wrong with me.
I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate to get support. And then, because I had done a bit of training delivery before, I was able to take that, put it together with my passion for mental health. And during the pandemic, it sounds awful, but there was a high demand for us supporting people with their mental health. I don't want to say it's good for business. That sounds awful, but you get the premise. And I'm lucky that I have a live-in marketing communications consultant in my wonderful wife, who is able to help me take the leap to create my own training consultancy, and I deliver a lot on behalf of charities, and I've got a trustee role and lots of stuff. But it's the one thing, if I can just steal 5 more seconds to say, is through the raft of all the things I do, from giving talks to at the base level awareness training right through to suicide intervention training, the one thing that comes through as a consistent thread in how to help someone else, I would say to your listeners, is helping someone to feel less alone. Whether you agree with what they're living with, whether you feel the same, whether it would affect you in the way it's affecting them, if you can help them to feel less alone, even if you don't do anything, even if you don't solve it, even if you can't rescue or fix them, which is very rare, if you can help them to feel less alone, you can save a life. So I would just like to get that across to people today, regardless of where they are, what they're doing, how they feel about others' experiences, if that's okay.
I think you have.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Take care, Mike. Thank you. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 26 minutes to 12 is the time. Emma says, I'm a university lecturer. I have responsibility for 250 PhD students at my university. The difference between just feelings and a diagnosis is the pervasiveness and degree of those feelings. I've taught students for the past 10 years, and I've seen increasingly severe anxiety and depression in my cohorts. They exist in a world that simultaneously does not switch off, there is no escape, and is incredibly precarious. There's no downtime. There's a constant pressure to respond, an overwhelming volume of criticism and noise. For your information, I'm 38 and I've taken today off as a result of anxiety caused by an inability to switch off and relentless demands on my time. I recognise myself in my students. So, I mean, there's another dimension then to this conversation, isn't there? Wherein you remove the illogic from it. So it is, I mean, this texter puts it well, Ben puts it well. But Paul was the texter earlier suggesting that if we had talked about mental health as openly and as frankly 80 years ago as we do today, then we would, to quote Paul, all be speaking German now. Ben writes, was Paul alive during the war? Does he have 20 grand of student debt? Is he trapped in a cycle of endless rent because he can't get onto the housing ladder? This generation has its own set of pressures to deal with, and it's ridiculous of other generations to dismiss them. And that's just, one element of it. You've got the insecure employment, wage theft, inequality, all of these things, which mean that struggling to cope is probably more normal than ever. And therefore, maybe this is part of what the professor was driving at. Therefore, there's not much point in, I can't take the next leap. I can't make the next connection. So really struggling to cope is normal, is a normal response to external stimuli. Therefore, we should talk less about mental health. That's the bit I don't get. Surely, if you are struggling to cope, you need help coping. And that help comes from people like Mike talking to you about your mental health, I think. Matthew's in Epsom. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking my call, and honestly, thank you for the conversations that you have around this subject. They've been really sort of eye-opening over the past few years.
Good.
I kind of want to come at this from a personal angle. So I'm 27. I kind of straddle that millennial Gen Z divide.
Is it Gen Z even for British people, Matthew?
Gen Z isn't Gen.
That's
Gen
not
Z,
a thing at all, is it? I just made that up.
Gen Z, maybe I just keep going to the American. Yeah.
No, I'm an Anglophile. I'm trying to stick up for the British pronunciation of things, but I sense it's a very lonely battle. So Gen Z it is, henceforth.
Gen Z. That's what I've heard more often. Yeah. So I kind of straddled that divide, and for me, the fact that there has been conversation about it for a lot of my sort of time growing up is the reason why I've been able to get the help that I've needed. Yeah. So to give a bit of context, I've been in counselling a couple of times over the sort of my mid-20s, and things got really, really tough for me at the start of this year, to the point where I reached out to my GP and took a different intervention. So I'm now on SSRIs, and they've honestly been the best intervention ever. It's exactly what I needed. But I think I wouldn't have got to that point if this generation wasn't so open and talking about it, because I only felt comfortable talking to a colleague that I was, really, really struggling, and her sort of making these suggestions of, okay, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? I wouldn't have been comfortable doing that if there wasn't a conversation about it as open as it is these days.
And you wouldn't have necessarily known that there were places to go and people to see, or the vocabulary that you need to articulate your struggles would have been denied to you if we were not having these conversations.
Absolutely. And I guess another sort of vein that I put that to is, and I know we talk a lot about how sort of internet and social media is quite toxic for mental health, and I do wholeheartedly agree with that. But one sort of benefit from it is the online conversation of, seeing something on YouTube or Instagram that you actually relate to. Someone is actually opening up and talking about difficult times or, their experience with a certain medication or whatever. It actually makes it, like, for example, over the past few years, I've definitely been watching this channel called Healthy Gamer GG, and I'd recommend it to anyone. It's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who...
I do get the fear when people do this without warning us. They're going to reference something that's entirely fruity or something like that. I'm fairly confident that you've not done that, but be aware. We like a heads up if we're going to do any on-air references to other sources.
Okay, that's fair. I'd say, in general, sort of people that have these conversations online make it easier for people to understand these things and relate to it.
Yes, exactly that. And you can't be what you can't see. So, being someone who is improving or working on, doing the work, as they say, is harder to be if you can't see someone else doing it, Matthew. In a sentence or two, the difference to your daily existence that for people who don't know, it's a form of antidepressant that you described earlier. How would you describe that?
It's like night and day.
That'll do.
Before, there were points where, like, on my moped ride to work, I was wanting to crash. I was had it in my head that I wanted to ride into a brick wall.
Yeah.
And now I am entirely integrated at work, and my ability to relate to people is so much better, and I feel bolder and just more confident and settled in myself.
That's such a helpful point that you make, because you are a statistic as well as a human being, and the statistics sometimes make it look as if everything is awful when we see the increased numbers of diagnoses, the increased numbers of people in treatment. But of course, you can't improve your situation unless you're in treatment and unless you're diagnosed. So your statistical status should, in many ways, be on the other side of the rhetorical divide, shouldn't it? It's someone who has. You'd have been a lot worse off if you hadn't gone down this route.
Yeah, exactly. I might have, if I hadn't, I might have been in the local newspaper as an article of someone who's not here anymore.
Well, thank God you're not. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And as our caller Rich mentioned earlier, if you are affected by any of these issues, the Samaritans are there all the time on 116 123. But also, as Matthew has reminded us, worth exploring other areas, other paths that you could explore as well. The first thing you have to do, and a lot of people expressing love for a healthy gamer that Matthew referenced there. I just get a little bit I get a bit nervous because you never know what people are referring to if you don't know what it is that they're referring to. But it's probably me being a bit oversensitive. Connor is in Falmouth. Connor, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hope you're well.
Yeah, very well. What's in your mind?
Just want to say that, how you know what you're dealing with isn't some fleeting thing, that it's not what everyone goes through. And I'd say it's how chronic and how crushing it is, how it feels and how it affects every aspect of your life. I've been dealing with sort of feelings like that for about 4 or 5 years now. Obviously all my life I've had ups and downs, but there's just no normal almost. And it reached the point one Christmas where I did reach out to get help.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of the support that's available nowadays. And if I hadn't, I might have been one of the silent few in few generations ago that wouldn't have made it to today to tell their stories. I think there's an element of survivorship bias there. I think that,
of course, well, maybe
the people that made it through are supposedly the tougher ones, or the people that didn't experience it, whereas the ones that didn't get help didn't make it.
That's very true. That's very true. What was the point that made you? And I know it's incremental, but there was a moment that wasn't incremental. There was a moment where you thought, I need to get some professional help. Can I ask what that entailed or not? I don't mind if you don't want to talk about it.
No, it's absolutely fine. I just had essentially just the Christmas alone. Family were away, and everything just sort of crept up.
Yeah.
And I had some trauma, sort of unresolved. And yeah, I couldn't imagine going another week, another 2 weeks, feeling the way that I felt.
Yeah.
So.
And you may have done, but that once that thought is in your head, it's impossible or very, very difficult to get it out again. And people talk, and then the response to that, which I was trying to articulate at the beginning, certainly before I had therapy, my response to you would have been, "Oh, come on, mate, it's not that bad. Come on, you're going to get through this. It's only one Christmas. Next Christmas you'll be," and that's the last thing that you wanted to hear. This is brilliant, this text here. Thank you, Connor, because this, I really think, cuts to the heart of what I was trying to say earlier. And again, you've asked me not to read out your name, so I won't. My dad was born in 1941. I realise now that he had acute anxiety from childhood onwards, probably not helped by being born on the worst night of the Blitz, but it was never diagnosed or recognised. He was a charming, very intelligent and gifted, but troubled man. He dealt with this by starting on the whiskey first thing in the morning. He died too young, at 59. In his day, all of this stuff was less acknowledged. Recognising mental health issues earlier could help prevent them turning into destructive issues, which I think is a sad tale, beautifully told. 11:48 is the time. A lot of love coming in for all the callers today, which is to be expected. There is another conversation. We won't have it today, but there is something that is a legacy of my sort of stiff upper lip days. You go to a school like mine, you are taught pretty much from day one that it's only pain, it doesn't really hurt. Even when the pain is being administered by the parents, by the adults who are in loco parentis, the adults who are in positions of care. And I've told you this before, it resonated more strongly for me than usual when Boris Johnson got COVID. And David Cameron said, "Oh, don't worry about Boris Johnson." I think he was in intensive care at this point. I've seen him play tennis. Just think about that for a minute. Pardon? I've seen him play tennis. But that's what happens. That's what you're taught in these schools that only existed really to sort of churn out soldiers of empire, is that you are taught to bury your emotional literacy. And it doesn't make you a bad person. And a lot of the time you don't even know that you're doing it until you find yourself claiming that tactics on the tennis court or a demeanour on the tennis court somehow would have a bearing upon how you responded to a potentially lethal virus. And what I don't know, because our society rewards people who have gone down, have buried that side of their personality. We as a society, perhaps more than any other, we really reward the inauthentic self. So what I don't know, and I wouldn't know where to start having a phone-in about this, is whether or not it sometimes has a negative impact on someone's life. Getting better mentally means you get worse materially. But we'll have that conversation on another occasion. I do remember saying to my therapist once, "I'm a bit worried you're going to therapise me out of a career." Because beating people up on the radio is kind of what I do for a living. And of course, it isn't anymore. So happy days that turned out. But you understand what I mean by that. Think of a public figure. Think of a famously pungent public figure, someone who has to have a strong opinion on everything and is never not seeking controversy or having fights. So if they actually had good therapy and got better, what would happen to their public profile? What would happen to their career? Do you see? That's all. It's a tiny little thought and a very silly personal one, but it's just there bubbling away in the back of my mind when we have conversations like this, because you kind of find yourself wondering whether, and you know you're wrong, but you do wonder whether sometimes some people would benefit from the stick rather than carrot approach, or from the robust, resilient, and that's why Mike's call from Stratford was so good, because it absolutely shut down that suspicion in a logical fashion, but it's not necessarily a logical suspicion in the first place. 11:51 is the time. Rob is in Brixton. Rob, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I've just been listening to everything your callers have come in and said, and there's really good, really supportive, really useful stuff in there. I've got a slightly different view as somebody who's on these waiting lists for mental health support, who's been interacting with these services, who also work closely with mental health clinics in South London in the NHS. And from my position, I see the extra diagnoses, the extra younger people and more people seeking mental health support is obviously, like a lot of your previous callers have said, is due to more awareness. But the lack of in response to that, there hasn't been an expansion of services. So it's creating a bigger and bigger backlog.
The services have been contracting since 2010, I think.
They're going to contract again.
Yeah.
So Labour aren't doing anything. Their pledge to reduce waiting list is in my view, so this is not an official NHS statement, but in my view, it's all
words.
Policy, it's more to reflect the more visible, more reported situations,
which is daft, really.
People in beds, in corridors, and stuff like that.
No, which is necessary. It shouldn't be either or.
Yes,
but
yes,
of course, in terms of the workforce and the economy, helping people get back to health would be a win-win, even if it involves short-term expenditure and exertion. Long-term,
exactly it.
Long-term, it's all good.
Short-term expenditure.
So what are you telling me exactly? That the downside of people coming forward more is that they won't get the help that they need, because we can't then conclude, well, they'd be better off not knowing what they're struggling with.
Yeah. No, it's one of the very rare and maybe even first times that increased health awareness has not come from government policy or NHS outreach. It has come from more social awareness, and I would wager that most of that has come from social media. People are asking more questions about their mental health. People are more accepting of those discussions with themselves, especially younger people, because they're getting a new education in how to identify.
How do you turn down awareness, though?
It's not a matter of turning down. It's just a matter of numbers. The people in control of this, they're not on the front line. They're looking at spreadsheets. So mental health support, mental health treatment is insanely expensive when compared to things like physiotherapy or.
But the line here, therefore, continuing mental health awareness may not be as beneficial as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So how do you?
That's a statement from somebody. While they're very educated in what they know,
yes,
they're not on TikTok.
Okay.
They're looking at it from the lens of we can't have doctors are over-diagnosing and stuff.
And it's got nothing to do with that. That's it. No, you've cracked it. That's the bit I've been struggling with. That's the bit I've been struggling. It's what Freddie Eyre would have called a category error, I think. So would you, though, present, unless you were really struggling? Because that's the other side of the conversation, isn't it? People who think, they're not that bad, I don't know why they're bothering doctors. So regardless of how you've come to a conclusion about your condition, I mean, CAMHS is a nightmare to engage with, and it's CAMHS that would have responsibility for most of these people age-wise. Would you really seek help unless your problems were profound?
Well, I've just taken myself off the wait list after having my wait extended months at a time, several times.
Yes.
And the last conversation I had with the service I was working with was over the last few years, interaction with this service has actually made my condition worse. This is my main stressor in life now.
Wow.
So that's a
well, that
real
is,
big
I mean,
problem.
crikey, that is an absolutely new dimension to the entire conversation. So you know that you need help, but the inability to access it is actually making the things that you need help with worse.
And I think it's important to make the point, and important for everyone listening to also understand that although, this is mental health is a health problem, the same way as any other physical ailment is, and it should be treated as such. However, when your appendix bursts, you're in pain, you go to seek help at that point in time. When somebody seeks help for their mental health, that's not the point at which their problem started. It's one of the biggest steps in healing is that moment where they seek help. And it's also one of the most vulnerable points for people. The rejection at that point, or not being taken seriously at that point, which is happening, can exacerbate things. So if anybody does, if a friend says they think they might, it could be ADHD, neurodivergency, or it could be depression. That point where someone says it's hard for people that haven't experienced it or don't have a lot of knowledge about this stuff, which is fine. Not everyone knows everything, but it's really important to understand that this isn't when it started. If they tell you they're feeling down on Thursday, it could have been a long, long downward road for the last few years. But in healthcare, that's obviously where treatment starts. That's where things start. This is the point that the patient presented. Yes, it will be taken into account that maybe they've felt low for X many years, but that wasn't. There were no notes for that. There's no tracking of that.
Good Lord, I'd never thought of it like that. I wish you weren't. I say this to a lot of people. I don't think I've ever felt it as keenly as I do with you. I wish you weren't so well qualified to make the contribution to the programme that you've just made, Rob.
It comes from experience. I mean,
that's what I mean. I wish you hadn't had the experience, because it can't have been fun for you. A lot of this.
No, but we won't get into that.
No, we won't get into that now. But thank you for helping all the people that you've just helped, because we'll never know how many or how much. But it wouldn't have happened without you. I want to squeeze in one more call, but I'm right up against the news, so I think we'll talk to Lou. But hopefully talk to Lou at the top of the next hour. In the next hour, something that is part of the mental health conversation, but on an altogether different level. And it's a story from the front of the Times newspaper today that really caught my eye. It's about, the headline is designed to catch your eye. That's what headlines do. Big payouts for workers contacted out of hours. Labour are to introduce a right to switch off plan. It's Sunday for Monday. I've told you what Sunday for Mondays are before. They're a very specific type of newspaper story that I may elaborate upon a little after the headlines. But it means that you will have help, like legislative help, to separate your work and home life. And I thought it might be an interesting moment to reflect upon what it's like to have an employer who refuses to recognise the distinction between your work life and your home life. I've also got a special edition of Unhinged Headline for you. It is 3 minutes after 12. Coming up, absolute absurdity that some employers deploy when it comes to your personal life. And what I don't want, I can be so bossy sometimes. What I don't particularly want is people who've done jobs where it's perfectly necessary for the line between work and home to be perforated, because I've done that. As a newspaper journalist, you're never really off duty. Certain types of newspaper journalism in general, actually, but newspaper journalism in particular, because the shifts are less codified. And also you want to get your name in the paper every day. So that's not what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about people who absolutely don't need to be blighting your every waking hour, but just don't seem to recognise that you're off the clock, that your working day has a beginning and an end. I just want to know what that's like. Find the most extreme examples of managers or bosses who are likely to be the target of legislation being considered by the government that would see compensation paid to workers who have had their downtime, their leisure time, their me time, their family time, their personal time completely polluted by bosses and managers. So we'll get onto that a little later, but I want to take a couple more calls on this, because it's a bit like property. Now here's a line you've not heard before. It's a bit like property prices. When somebody of a certain age tells you that they don't understand why young people today are constantly complaining about not being able to buy houses, they just need to work harder. We bought our first house in 1952 and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then you say, and most people who bought a house in 1952 don't need this, but somehow these are the opinions that somehow end up having the largest reach. And you say, well, how much did your house cost? And how much did you earn? And you point out that the relationship between what they earned and what their home cost was completely alien from what the scenario is today. So suggesting to people in their 20s and 30s that they might like to consume fewer avocados or cancel their Netflix subscription in order to buy a Muse house in Knightsbridge is, to say the very least, unhelpful. And I think there's something similar with mental health. I think most people of a certain age know that we do young people a great service by increasing understanding of poor mental health, by increasing understanding of neurodivergency, by diagnosing ADHD or autism. We rescue people from a lifetime of repression or confusion or masking. Most people know that. But some people need a little bit of help. And I think that's why these conversations can be so helpful. You don't hear the same conversation anymore about dyslexia that you did even when I started in this job. They're just thick or they're just lazy. No such thing. Don't be ridiculous. How can you medicalise someone who's bad at reading? That's the same, isn't it? When you think about it. And so, 20 years from now, conversations about ADHD and other neurodivergences will sound the same as conversations about dyslexia do. And the idea that we spent time wondering whether it was actually real, and I used to say, if you were listening to this program years ago, you'll have heard me say, we just called it naughty in my day. Lou is in Bury St Edmunds. Lou, what would you like to say?
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to say I really identify with young people and how some of them are struggling. I'm 71 now, and 53 years ago I was at college. I just started college at 18 and went home after 3 weeks, and just to be told that my brother had been killed the day before.
Oh, my dear.
And I had a couple of weeks at home, and then my parents insisted I went back to college, and the doctor said you should go back, and so I did. And nobody, not anybody there in a position of, authority showed any iota of compassion or even mentioned it in 3 years. And what that did really was to set a pattern that has been there all my life.
Gosh.
You learn that the only way that you can get through is to basically, somehow it just disappears within yourself, and you learn that you work and you work and you work and you push it away.
You bury it. You bury it. You don't talk about your pain.
You bury it. You don't talk about it. My family didn't want to talk about it. This was a much-loved individual,
yes.
And we were very close in age, so we were almost like twins, very close in age. And that set a pattern whereby I thought I could cope with anything. And I became a head teacher, and this carried on. I can work hard, I can do this, I can do that. Any problems that come up, I can solve them.
Right.
And then I got chronic fatigue. Yeah. So I had to leave my job, which was hard. And I've, I'm gradually got back to the place I am now, yes, where I can live a fairly normal life. But I had a particularly bad sort of sequence of things happen to me from 2011 to 2020, with mum and dad dying, my other brother dying, my son really ill, and so on and so forth. And I just carried on. And then recently, with a marriage breakup that was unexpected, I learned that I couldn't cope anymore. And it was a bit of a revelation to me.
Because you'd never admitted vulnerability before. I mean, chronic fatigue notwithstanding, that wasn't something you could talk yourself out of. Everything else you thought you could.
Yeah, I did. Gosh. I didn't allow any vulnerability. And I suppose you just don't let other people in. You just think, I can solve this. It's almost like putting a little glass box.
Which makes you emotionally absent for the people that you love as well sometimes.
Yeah, it does. And so what I've learned these last 2 months is that it's perfectly okay to fall to bits. It's perfectly okay to feel. But I've only learned that by surrounding myself with people who I can reach out to, and a doctor who I walk with, who does a cognitive sports therapy group. You know, I've learned to not be afraid of feeling, and that has been a revelation to me. And it's still ongoing, and I'm still learning, and I'm still kind of rediscovering parts of myself and discovering new things about myself. But I just think it's essential that somebody listens to these young people, because it's a very vulnerable age as well.
It is.
You know,
and you know, there is an awful lot to be worried about in their world, but possibly even more than there was in yours when you were their age.
I didn't have all those external things.
No, but you had the trauma of a loved brother not being able to mourn him properly, not being able to grieve.
Yeah.
That's trauma.
Yeah.
That's a trauma.
It wasn't, I think it was about 50 odd years later that I actually talked about it to a therapist.
Lou, crikey.
And, you know, I mean, he was wonderful, the therapist. And the other thing is that I've been fortunate in that I've been able to afford to go and see people.
Yeah,
and if you know, if you can't do that, what do you do?
That is a question that we are probably going to have to ask on the programme on another day, isn't it? Because the access that actually the last caller, Rob, I think it was referring to, is almost impossible if you can't afford it. So what you're saying for people who need me to join the dots, and I don't imagine anyone particularly does, is that you are now looking after your 18-year-old, your grieving 18-year-old self, and that frees you in ways that you never knew existed or you never knew you needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as I say, it's been a really difficult process to go through, but I have been fortunate that I have a good network.
Yeah, clearly you do. And you know, we acknowledge the serendipity of it because we know that network, that access is not available to everybody. It's lovely to hear you talk like that. The phrase I always come back to, and my journey was nothing like yours, but it's like discovering quite late in life that the house you've always lived in has a garden that you've never come across before. That's how I sometimes think of it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, I've never seen that door before. What's on the other side of that? Oh, bloody hell, it's still my house. But now it's got this amazing garden. Thank you, Lou. Last word on this to Matthew, who's in Eaglescliffe in County Durham. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
It's funny that caller has just mentioned paying for her own therapy. It's what I ended up doing because I got to a point where I felt there was no other option but suicide, and the medication I was on just wasn't helping me to even cope, let alone feel better. And I don't know what made me do it. I just started looking for a counsellor online and found someone. And I've been having therapy for 7 months now. And the person I was is unrecognisable now as a result.
I mean, what are your sort of? I don't want to oversimplify your situation, but what would be breakthroughs in terms of therapy? What would be points that really changed your game?
Well, one of the worst things about depression is it makes you feel worthless and that you are a burden on everybody around you. And it was actually not that, but it was the root cause, which was that I had a bit of a childhood learned behaviour where being good or being a good person was represented by putting myself out for other people.
Right. A people pleaser.
And yeah. So when I was asked to do something, I would pretty much automatically say yes, regardless of how tired or well I was feeling. And I would just run myself into the ground until the point that I was exhausted. And giving time to myself.
And you thought you had to be like that to be a good boy? To be a good person.
To be a good boy. Yeah. And what the point I actually called about was my daughter's 19,
Right.
and she has significant social anxiety.
Right.
And the other callers have already made a point about this, but you were talking about giving younger people a chance to speak about how they feel, and that we shouldn't diminish it just because it feels lesser than what we've experienced. For her, she grew up in a household where me and her mum tried to help her understand how she was feeling, and we would talk about feelings a lot. So she recognised in herself more often when she wasn't feeling very well or wasn't feeling the best, but didn't really know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So we'd given her the information, but not the tools.
Gosh.
And I think part of that generation now, I'm 47, so I think she's in the generation we're talking about. They're acutely aware of feelings, but they, like us, weren't taught to be stoic and put them all down. We
Yes.
taught them to bring them out. And then it feels like the NHS is playing catch-up almost.
And then the system isn't there to provide the support that's needed. I think that's part of what the professor was saying, although obviously bits of it are a little less. I'm a little less comfortable with, but that is a call for systemic change. And I don't think it's unduly cynical to point out the material benefits of it, let alone it's when I'll tell you who it makes me think of. It makes me think of James Timpson. They've just put in the House of Lords, and
love him.
Do you know who I mean?
Yes, I love him. I think he's brilliant.
I do as well. I think he's from your neck of the woods, isn't he? So anyway, that's by the by. Maybe a bit further south. But when he talks about doing the work that he does with prisoners and bring them into the family business and looking after the staff in a way that most employers would balk at. And he explains it as being good for business. So everybody thinks that he's this wonderful altruist, which he is. He categorically is. But he's not doing it. He's not John the Baptist. He's not doing it from a sort of Jesuitical system of sacrifice, which sounds a bit like what you used to be like, thinking that you can only prove your goodness by exerting yourself to the point of exhaustion on behalf of other people. He points out constantly it's good for business, a better business because it's full of happy people, and it's a better country when it's full of healthy, happy people. So whatever it costs in the short term, because politicians always have to bring things down to money, and so they do. That's not a criticism; it's just a fact. Then providing the tools that you've just described, making people aware of their problems but not giving them the tools it's the worst possible world, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a source of guilt, but
it's not our
I'm
fault.
working through that.
Aren't we all? We're all working through. We're all doing the work, or at least we're trying. Matthew, thank you. It's 12:17. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. So, again, part of the therapeutic process, look back on opinions you used to have and try to work out why you had them after you've realised that they were toxic. So, why did I used to believe that if you work for somebody, they kind of own you? Where would that have come from? The idea that if you don't like it, I'll find someone else to do it. I'll find someone else who does. Would that have been a way of justifying the stress that I was put under as a young newspaper journalist by essentially, so what you do in these situations, and this is sadly why abuse can sometimes be perpetuated, a cycle of abuse can build up, is that you put a lot of effort into convincing yourself that it didn't do you any harm. And it's a very short hop from saying that this process didn't do you any harm to essentially saying that everybody should actually be exposed to this process and it actually does you good. So when I started thinking about payouts for workers contacted out of hours, I was not expecting corporal punishment to pop into my head. But it has done, because, as I've told you on a few occasions, I spent quite a lot of time convinced that corporal punishment was a good thing. Outwardly, and I thought inwardly certain that adults hurting children deliberately as a punishment was a good thing. It was character forming. And of course, the reason why I thought that was because it was a way of minimizing the hurt that it caused me. So being, and compared to a lot of people, my experiences, particularly the kind of schools I went to, were not headline making, but being routinely brutalised, beaten is a good word, being routinely beaten did me harm, psychological harm. The physical pain dissipates quite quickly, but the psychological harm, the shame and the pain, and the effort I put into trying to dial down that shame and pain becomes a process of arguing that it didn't actually do me any harm. It was character forming, or it was good for me. And it's a tiny hop from saying it didn't do me any harm, it was character forming, to saying I think everybody should be beaten. I think everybody should be beaten. That's the way to do it. Everybody should be beaten. So I think, and this, for people who haven't been lucky enough to have any therapy or anything like that, and by the way, if you're absolutely adamant that you don't need it, you almost certainly would benefit from it more than even people who know that they need it. But the question, this is what you do, is you try and work stuff out. So how on earth did I end up thinking that your boss has the right to tell you to do whatever your boss wants you to do? Go and fetch my dry cleaning. Go and place a bet for me. These are all things that have actually happened to me in the early years of my career. Go and sit outside that shop and go and queue outside that shop because I want some shoes that are going to sell out before they've even got clothes. So, and that it maybe within working hours, you could make a case for saying that your boss can do whatever you want. But how did I end up arriving at LBC believing, if this had been a phone-in 15 years ago, believing that there's nothing wrong with employers making extraordinary demands of employees because they pay your wages? That would be the phrase you use, wouldn't it? It's one of those phrases, a bit like, do you know who I am? Don't you know who I am? If you hear someone say, I pay your wages to a public servant, you know that you're dealing with an absolute hemorrhoid. In the same way that if you hear somebody say, I don't you know who I am? You know that you're dealing with an absolute human hemorrhoid. It's the same sort of process, but I had my own mini version of it, which would have been, well, he's paying your wages. They pay your wages. Therefore, you do what they say. So there it is. That's how therapy works. I have just worked out why I ended up, when I arrived at LBC, believing that your boss should pretty much be able to brutalise you. Because it had happened to me. As a newspaper journalist, as the world's worst show business editor, I kind of oscillated between epic arrogance, as you would expect, and incredible vulnerability, where I had to strap on this armour, knowing, I remember, oh man alive, the Nokia. Have I told you about the Nokia ringtone? I must have told you about the Nokia ringtone. That still makes my tummy turn over, because if it went off after 10 o'clock at night, there's someone on the other end of the phone shouting at me. I go into work the next day and there's another 10,000 stories that I'd missed that were right under my nose. And people would shout at me in public, like in a room full of people. I'd be all, and I had to be the person that shouted back. So I'd be, well, you didn't print a story last week about Sooty. How dare you suggest that I should have been across this Spice Girls scandal a little bit soon. And I'm not that. That's not me. That's not me. I want to sit in the corner reviewing books, and somehow I ended up as a bloody gossip columnist, going to parties where I'm terrified of talking to anybody and then getting shouted at and shouting back. And I remember one occasion where I thought about fainting. I genuinely thought about fainting. I'm standing there and I remember watching this little fleck of spittle make its way from the mouth of a news editor across. It caught the light as it arced across the space between us, and it landed on my upper lip. Some spittle from his mouth landed because he's shouting at me. And I had this terrible combination of characteristics. Number one, I went to public school, although I wasn't properly posh. For people that didn't go to public school, I was posh. Number two, the editor really looked out for me. The editor really liked me, which is a nightmare when you're dealing with the Neanderthals on the news desk. And number three, I came across, God knows how, I was very cocky. And so they used to relish brutalising me in public on the occasions where I didn't have a leg to stand on. And I watched this bit of spittle make its way arc. It's like in slow motion and landed on my lip. And what do? You can't. And I thought, I'm going to have to faint. I'm going to have to go down. I'm going to have to hit the floor. Do you remember when Gillian McKeith fainted on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. And she went, or I think it's happened on Curb Your Enthusiasm. Like, you can spot, unless you go down like a log, bang. Unless you go down like a lamppost, like a felled tree, you can't fake fainting. Because your natural instinct is to put your go knee first, or put your hand. I'm having this dialogue in my head while being screamed at by someone 10 years older than me and physically perfectly capable of slapping me about a bit. And I think I'm going to have to fight. How the hell do I get out of this? And I did get out of it, amazingly. And the reason why I arrived at LBC convinced that if they pay your wages, they can do what they want is the same reason why I arrived at LBC convinced that corporal punishment was good for people, because that was the effort I'd put in to convincing myself that stuff that had hurt me had not hurt me. And because it had not hurt me, there was absolutely no reason why it shouldn't happen to you. That is the first time I've clocked that comparison. Why on earth did he used to argue that people can do whatever they want to do? 28 minutes after 12 is the time. And what I want to know from you is, I don't need the big therapy reveal, although feel free to join me if you are so minded. I want to hear about the requests, and you need to hit the phones quickly on this one because we're quite short of time. And it's a slightly different phone in to usual because I am going to conduct it in a slightly more light-hearted fashion than you might expect. So the serious conversation is about the damage that a completely, absurdly demanding boss can do. So book your place now if you've got that one. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That just how damaging an absurdly demanding boss can be. But alongside that, in the shallow end of this conversation, what is the most ridiculous thing your boss or your manager has ever asked you to do? I mean, the point at which you thought, I can't stay in this. This is so. It might be. Would you mind cancelling your holiday? Would you mind awfully cancelling your holiday because we've got a big shipment coming in? And any chance you could get married on another Saturday? Did you see what I mean? So there are two things here. There is the headline event, the thing that you look back on and go, what the hell was happening there? And then there's the broader question of why thousands of pounds of compensation for employees who have been consistently contacted by their bosses outside of normal working hours is almost certainly a good thing. So what we want is this. What's it like to be consistently badgered, bombarded, contacted by your bosses outside of your working hours? Just talk me through that. 0345 6060 973. And the second bit of it is, what is the single most outrageous thing an employer has asked you to do? Up to and including crimes. Let's not faff about. Up to and including major crimes. So obviously I don't want to get into any trouble, but what the reality of a boss who just doesn't understand boundaries, and then the single most extraordinary request you've ever had made of you by an employer, by a boss or a manager. All right, 0345 6060 973. Have I ever told you about the time my manager in a men's retail store asked to see my underpants? Have I ever? I don't think that necessarily counts, but it's in the right ballpark. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It's 12:34. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Some of these examples are pretty special. Some of them sort of less so. The ones that aren't necessarily what I'm looking for sometimes turn out to be the funniest when we have conversations like this. I like this from David. Probably not what you're looking for, James, but my boss messaged me one morning asking if I could give her a call about one of my files, which she was having trouble locating. Normally this wouldn't have been a problem, but I'd been made redundant the day before, and I didn't work for her anymore. So a slight sort of tin ear on the behalf of employers, or absolutely absurd levels of bombardment and bothering by people who don't understand that when the clock stops, you're on your own time. You're no longer theirs. You're no longer their property. Zin is in Poole. Zin, what would you like to say?
Well, when I lived in Atlanta, James, I was in in-ground concrete swimming pool designer, and it was December. And
hang on a minute. Where were you? An in-ground concrete swimming pool designer?
In Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Where you can swim 9 months of the year.
I like it. And I was going to be a bit annoying then and ask, well, how hard is it? But you can have a lozenge-shaped pool. You could have a pool that has different annexes to.
You can have a guitar-shaped pool.
A guitar-shaped pool. The world is your oyster when you are an in-ground concrete swimming pool designer. You can have any. What was the strangest request you ever received?
I don't think I ever had a strange one that I couldn't tackle.
Okay.
Anyway, on to the story.
Yes, sorry.
I was the only female in a sales force, national sales force of 440 people. And in the Atlanta office, I was the number one salesperson of the month, 7 months out of the year. And so it was December. It's slow. People don't want their gardens torn up over Christmas or Thanksgiving, that time of year. So I thought I would take myself down to Florida to see some friends and have a good time. And I had to be back at work on the Monday, and I went Wednesday night, so I took Thursday, Friday, Saturday off, and Sunday would have been my own. Anyway, on the drive down, I'm in Jacksonville, my car breaks down, and I have to be towed, and it was a Honda something or other, Accord I think it was, and they had to order parts. I was going to be down there a week, so I called my boss on Friday to say, look, my car broke down, I will not be coming in on Monday. And he goes, well, can you get on a plane? I said, well, can you buy me the ticket? He goes, no. And he said, rent a car. I said, are you paying for the rental car? He said, no. And I said, I just looked at my pina colada, and I said, I think we're done here, Howard. My drink is melting. And I hung up on him.
It made it easily identifiable, quite a lot of detail about the business. And now at the end, as the clincher, the name of the boss. Is that, I mean, just to be the devil's advocate for a moment.
Yeah.
You kind of have it. It's not his job to make sure you can get to work, is it?
Wait a minute. I should have said, and this is straight commission. I'm not on any salary. I'm earning whatever I earn on my own back. So it's not like I'm being paid unless I'm working.
Yes.
So I felt well entitled to just tell him goodbye.
And was that the end of your swimming pool-based career?
Well, no, not really. I mean, I did go in on whatever week I got and told him I quit because I thought he was going to fire me. And he said, well, I had this, I looked like, I don't know how to describe my appearance, but he said, where do you think you're going to get a job looking like that?
Gosh, what did you look like?
Stevie Nicks.
Oh, okay, yeah. Back comb.
Yeah. Big hair.
Yeah.
A lot of makeup. And, this is like, in what year am I talking? The 80s. So
and you know what the ultimate irony of this story is, don't you?
Tell me.
Well, look where you've ended up living.
Yeah, that's true. But we got a beach. We don't need a pool.
There you go. No pool in pool. 12:38 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Just a quick throwback, actually, Jane, because this really caught my eye to the conversation we were having in the second hour of the programme. So my dad's only form of punishment was physical violence, James. When he was hitting me as a teenager, actually, no, this is relevant to this hour as well. I asked him why he always hit us, and he said his dad had hit him and it didn't do him any harm. I said, I beg to differ. Katie's in Wandsworth. Katie, what would you like to say?
Hiya.
Hello.
Hi. It was just a quick story. Basically, I worked at Wimbledon Tennis over the summer in the queue, and we met this one guy that basically had been kind of sent on like a mission by his boss to queue, basically camp overnight, go through the whole queue just to get a ticket for his boss, basically.
So he wouldn't go to the tennis himself?
No, he basically sent one of his employees to queue for him
that's
and get him a ticket.
So then he would phone his boss and say, you better get down here quickly, you're getting in.
Yeah, when he had the ticket, yeah.
When he was near the front of the queue. Was he quite chill about that? Or
yeah, he was actually, the spirit in the queue anyway is quite kind of...
Because that might have been a volunteer situation. He might have got extra money and it would be ordered to do it when you really didn't want to, would be the kicker, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It was just quite funny seeing him there on the orders of his boss, basically.
What did your job involve then? What is the job if you're working? What are you doing? Just making sure everyone's okay?
Yeah, because there's obviously like a great number of people camping. So, we did have like particular roles like in the morning and stuff, but it was mostly just kind of speaking to people and keeping the spirits high, the tennis basically.
Well, what would we do without you? A smoothly run queue, 12:39 is a prerequisite of any successful event. here's a good one. My boss thinks, this is a present tense one from Rob, nothing of contacting me out of work times. Well, that's got a religious element to it, hasn't it, Rob? So I don't know what the rules are when it comes to imposing on other people who don't necessarily have the same religious requirements that you find yourself in. I see a lot of social media go-getter entrepreneur types thinking that tough times create strong men and easy times create weak men. That's very relevant to the conversation we were having earlier, and it ties in with this one as well. I asked for a day off for a friend's funeral. It was on my 20th birthday, and I was asked by my boss whether I was sure it was for a funeral. They then went on to say that you can take the day off this time, but don't make a habit of it. Gladly, I didn't need to make a habit of attending funerals on my birthday. And I quite like this. It's again, Kirsty, it's a client, isn't it, rather than a boss. But in a sense, if you're self-employed, then your clients are your boss. Bridal hair and makeup artist. I had one bride ask me to reschedule my C-section to the day after her wedding so that she could have her makeup and hair done by me. I suppose you could describe that as a compliment. And Ash makes, well, I think we should do more on the programme. And I often say we should do this more on the programme, and then I forget. International comparisons, so we actually get an idea of what it's like in the UK compared to what it's like elsewhere. Ash says, I work for a Swedish company. It is written into my contract that I can only be contacted whilst on leave once per year. If it happens twice, I am compensated with huge payouts and bonuses, which ensures that they leave me alone whenever I'm on leave to relax and enjoy my life away from work. That's the point, isn't it? When you're never off duty. Now, on newspapers, I'm sure it's different now, but that is it was kind of par for the course. It was the same for my father. A phone could ring at any point, day or night, and he would be required to get in the car and go and cover a story. But you absolutely know you've signed up for that. I'm interested in what it's like to have a normal 9-to-5 job with a boss or a manager who refuses to reflect or respect the fact that after 5 and before 9, you do not work for him. Germany, similar as well. In Germany, you're not allowed to contact him. Your employer is not allowed to contact you outside your working hours by law, says Alex. And I think that's probably the way forward. Charlie's in Cranley. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Charlie.
I have a Robert Maxwell story.
Robert Maxwell. Oh, go on then. This will be good.
It was during the 1980s. You may remember when he launched the London Daily News as a kind of stalking paper for the Evening Standard, and it lasted about 6 weeks. Yes. Anyway, I worked for the advertising agency that helped him launch this, so we did all the marketing for it. And a mate of mine was account director on the business. So we were in our 20s, I guess. Anyway, Maxwell, this was pre-mobile phones or the widespread use of them. Maxwell would insist that this guy, Adam, this friend of mine, would have to give him a telephone number where he could be contacted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Wherever he was, whatever he was doing.
Wherever he was. So one evening, he got invited out for dinner with his girlfriend. Yeah. To a dinner party, and he just sent the phoned up Maxwell's secretary and said, "This is where he could be reached." Anyway, 1 o'clock in the morning, Robert Maxwell, the hostess of the dinner party, the phone went. She picked up the phone. And she went, "Adam, there's someone called Maxwell on the phone for you." And he went, "Oh my God!" So he got on the phone, and Maxwell said, "Adam, I want you in Headington Hall at 5 o'clock this morning." So 4 hours later,
he's on a string, isn't he? It's control freakery and bullying. But in the 80s, I'm not going to say it was acceptable in the 80s because I think that's a cultural reference that will go over your head. What about the sort of Gordon Gekko? Did Adam enjoy elements of this because it proved how important and what's the word I want? Essential he was.
Well, the end of the story was that he got to Headington Hall at 5 a.m, and Maxwell had left in his helicopter to go to Cornwall. So that was pretty grim. But no, I mean, the dark side of this was that Adam had a more or less a nervous breakdown.
Oh, I see. Yes, because you cannot stay on an even keel when you're being bombarded with utterly unexpected missiles at all. The next missile could come at any point, so you can never relax.
No, and I think he was he was psychotic, I guess.
Maxwell, yes. He's certainly a very challenged. God, I haven't heard a Robert Maxwell story in years. Charlie, thank you. 12:45 is the time. It is 12:48. Dom's in Wandsworth. He says, if one employee comes an hour early and leaves an hour late, and the other comes dead on 9 and leaves dead on 5, then I'll be promoting the one who puts in the extra time, which is great. I'd promote the one who was better at the job, Dom. But horses for courses, I suppose. And also, you shouldn't be stealing off your employees like that. That's 2 hours a day of wage that you're stealing, which is a terrible example. If it's okay for you to steal from them, then maybe the one who comes in early and leaves late will think that it's okay for him to steal from you. Maybe he's waiting for you to go home before he sort of empties out the stationery cupboard or helps himself to all the Nespresso pods or the kitchen. I'm giving away clues here as to what I pilfer, what I routine. I don't pilfer. How dare you suggest that I pilfer things? But what would it be? Kitchen roll and Nespresso pods. 12:48 is the time. Employers who don't seem to acknowledge that employees have a life outside work. Robert Maxwell's getting quite a few. Who knew there were so many former Mirror Group employees listening to the programme? Tom's one of them. He goes, I worked there in the 80s, James. Apparently, he used to call senior staff and board members to Headington, this was his country home outside Oxford, on Christmas Day for meetings, for no particular purpose other than to make sure that they came, and if they didn't, they could be fired. That's the kind of attitude I'm talking about, and oddly, that was in newspapers. So maybe it was an exceptional environment in which to sort of learn or end up believing that they can do whatever they want if they've got you on the payroll. Kim's in Romsey. Kim, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James.
Hello,
First-time caller.
Welcome aboard.
Yeah. Again, like your previous call of pre-mobile phones, in the 80s, I was working for an estate agents in Knightsbridge, and my boss, a very wealthy man, had a rental investment very close to Harrods, and he, on a Saturday night, managed to track me down to another colleague's 40th birthday party, or 30th, doesn't matter, but anyway, he tracked me down there on the landline and asked me to go and break into his flat. I was living in Tooting at the time, to break into his flat, to turn the alarm off, which was a second-floor flat.
What was it about your performance as an estate agent that made him think you might have a sideline as a cat burglar, Kim?
I've got no idea. But, actually, I think he knew I did a bit of rock climbing.
I thought you were going to say robbery then. So did you?
Could have been either.
So did you? And did you rise to the challenge?
Yeah, well, he was a big boss.
Yeah.
He sadly is no longer with us. But he'd made a lot of money, and it was a very successful firm.
So you're not allowed to say no. That's kind of what we're describing, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
No, there was no way I could say no. And fortunately, by then I hadn't had anything to drink, so I was able to drive. And I drove up there and managed to get the caretaker to let me into the common areas, and I got into the back and then climbed up the staircase, the fire escape staircase, to the second floor and broke in through the back through the kitchen window. He'd given me the code for the alarm, so I was able to turn the alarm off. Managed to cut myself a few times because I was too clever. But anyway, all good, and the caretaker said that he would climb up there and seal up the window with newspaper or whatever until somebody could fix it on Monday. But anyway, I got into work on the Monday, and about 2 hours into the morning, his wife arrived as a thank you present with a live lobster for me.
In a rhythm of art, a bond that never falls apart. Through the highs and through the lows, together our connection grows. passion grows. From childhood dreams to grown-up schemes, we navigate life's endless streams. Hand in hand we face the night. Side by side we find the light. Brotherhood forever strong, in each other's arms where we belong. Through the storm and through the fire, our bond will never tire.
A live lobster.
Yeah.
As a thank you for breaking into his flat and turning off the burglar alarm.
Yes.
It's a different world, Kim, isn't it? Honestly, what was it Scott Fitzgerald said? The rich are not like you and I, or something like that.
Yeah, so they got it, or she'd found it in Knightsbridge. They have them in the fish tanks at restaurants, so I don't know where she got it from.
They've got them in Harrods. Well, I don't know if they did then, but they're in I was in the food hall in Harrods yesterday, as it happens, and they had lobsters there. But I mean, what an odd
they have
thing!
That wonderful fish display, don't they,
It's
as well?
extraordinary. I bought some Nigerian prawns. Unfortunately, I had to sell a kidney in order to buy half a dozen, but they were more like langoustines. They're the biggest prawns I've ever seen. I put them on the barbecue last night. It was a triumph, Kim, a triumph. But as a young man about town in his 20s in Knightsbridge in the 1980s, I can't imagine that a live lobster was top of your list of sort of desirable bonuses.
No, cash would have been nice.
Exactly that. You could take it back for a refund as long as it was still alive.
But it was lovely.
Yeah, and also you added to your repertoire a crash course in how to prepare a lobster. Thank you, Kim. Phil's in Liverpool. Phil, what can you tell us?
Hi, James. How you doing?
I'm all good, Phil. What happened?
Well, I sort of look back on it and smile now. It's anecdotal, but at the time, it really did break me. Really, actually did break me. I had a guy I was working for, and 2-3 times a week, he would send me these big, long, bullet-pointed emails, which he called brain dumps, of stuff that had occurred to him. And I would get these like 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night sometimes. He did put me on the spot of asking me the classic question, would you not go on holiday 2 days before I was to go?
Good. Did he expect you to respond to the brain dumps, the email brain dumps? Are you supposed?
Oh, yeah. I was supposed to.
I mean, I probably set this topic up the wrong way round. I should have gone in harder on this and a bit lighter on the funny stories. Although, to be fair, I've enjoyed the funny stories enormously. But that psychology there of just not recognising that you have any life or any purpose outside your usefulness to him.
Yeah. I think he himself had issues because in and around the job, he sort of had OCD, and he's a strange guy. But the worst one, I mean, he was really breaking me. I used to lie awake at night, my stress and anxiety levels with. I'd been in work sort of 40 years. I never felt this.
But you'd never had it. It's that thing. It's that knowledge that you can't relax because at any point, even if you went for a week without him contacting you, you still wouldn't relax on the 8th day.
No,
because you'd know that being at home, being in bed, being in the bath, being in a restaurant, none of it matters. If he wants you, he'll come and get you, and that means you can't relax.
And the one I finished it, the worst one, was during the last sort of, 6 months or so of my employment there. My father was dying, which he knew.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
It was a sort of a common theme because his father had died a couple of years earlier. And he telephoned me once, approaching Christmas, on a Saturday morning with a verbal brain dump this time.
Right.
And said, "That's opened by saying, I thought, I'm okay, where are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm in the hospital with my dad. I'm actually sitting by the side of the bed." And he said, "Oh, sorry about that." And then proceeded with the brain dump anyway.
So, well, yeah, you're right. He had issues of his own. So I'm sorry about that. Anyway, back to me. Back to me and my needs as you're spending some of your final hours with your dying father. Yeah, well, crikey, that is probably, well, I hope about as an extreme an example as we are likely to encounter. Speaking of extreme examples, I do want to squeeze in a special edition today of
Unhinged Headlines,
because it's a follow-up Right, so last week we had a selection of unhinged headlines, including this from David Frosty Frost. We can no longer say that Britain is a free country. Laws criminalising certain opinions are now having a chilling effect on freedom of expression in the UK. A load of old codswallop by any reasonable measure. But somebody with more time on their hands than I've got has clocked the fact that less than a year previously, when it was a different kind of protest, when people were protesting for a ceasefire in Gaza, people wanted a ceasefire in Gaza, and they were having protests, the same man wrote under the headline, "It's not anti-free speech to restrict demonstrations. We do need to protect freedom of expression, but these aggressive protests aren't civilised dissent. So racist riots targeting asylum seekers, hotels, mosques and police. We can no longer say that Britain is a free country." And then marches calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. "It's not anti-free speech to restrict demonstrations. We need to protect freedom of expression, but these aggressive protests aren't civilised dissent." So a special edition thereof.
Unhinged headline.
And the last word, staying, I think, oh no, it's not a fish restaurant. George is in Chelmsford with the last story on this unreasonable bosses. What happened, George?
Hello, fella. Well,
Hello, mate.
about 10 years ago, I found myself in the fast food restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
And
working?
I remember... Say again, sorry?
Working or eating?
Working.
Okay,
I was working.
okay, carry on.
And I finished my shift probably about 4 or 5 o'clock p.m. And as I walked out the door, back then there was my dad. He was ready to pick me up, as per usual. However, he looked very different. And as I approached him, he said, "Things have changed with your granddad.
Oh, no.
Things are looking for the worse."
Right.
So we quickly got in the car and we drove from Essex all the way up to Norfolk. And when we got there, it was pretty apparent that it wasn't going to be very long until he was going to die. He was in his 80s and he was ill for a good 10 years. And after learning this knowledge, I picked up the phone and I phoned into work just to say I wasn't going to be there the next day or two.
Yeah.
And explain the situation. And our boss at the time, she simply replied, "Okay, but now think about me. I've got to try and get someone to cover you last minute. This is all a bit inconsiderate. And next time, she
Next
said,
time your granddad
next time-
passes away.
Yeah,
Try and give
next
me a bit
time,
more notice.
Think about it.
Yes.
Exactly that.
That is the mindset. I've got to crack on, George, because Sheila's back from holiday and people are itching to hear what she's been up to and what thoughts she's
Very
returned, embellished and polished. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's Sheila Fogarty. 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 But now it's Sheila